Howdy, folks. Welcome to the Hunting Stories Podcast. I'm your host, Michael, and today we're going to hear some stories from Ross Kearney. I met Ross actually back in April, and he left an impression right away. Today, he's going to tell us a few stories, but the main one being a story of survival. He then follows that up with some really creepy tales from his family farm in rural Pennsylvania. I don't want to steal any of his thunder, so let's go ahead and kick this thing off. I want to thank Ross for coming on. Now let's let him tell his stories. Ross, how are you, buddy? Thank you so much for joining the Hunting Stories Podcast.
Hey man, thanks for having me. Doing well. A little warm down here, but it's cooled off to 97 degrees Fahrenheit, which is probably like 30 Celsius. It has been hot.
I do not envy your Texas summers, man. I was down there for a year, and I couldn't have been happier to get back to Colorado. We had 97 yesterday, but it's a dry 97, which is a big difference.
And I do miss the dry heat of West Texas, but I would also take no heat, so
Cool,
there's
man,
that.
cool. Well, why don't we, I know who you are. We've obviously talked before, but why don't we introduce yourself to the listeners?
So my name is Ross Kearney, and I am basically your average Joe bow hunter that picked up a stick bow back in the day and did all kinds of wild things with it as a kid. Shot feed sacks from 30 yards and 50 yards, and yeah, it just goes on. And eventually, it led to bow hunting compound bows, and one bow turned into, I think we're on like 10 now.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah, it's gotten a little out of hand at times, as some of my hobbies tend to do. But I am 33 years old. I have to stop and think about it now. There's something after 30 you just can't remember anymore. You're like, what am I, 33? Yeah, got it.
Yeah. I'm rolling up. I'm at 38, and I know exactly that vibe. I have to ask my wife all the time, how old am I? Often ask her, how old are you? Because I know that I'm exactly 1 year older.
Yeah, we're exactly the same age. So if I ask her, she's like, we're 33. I'm like, okay, got it.
There you go. There you go, man.
But
So you've been hunting your whole life, and you picked up archery when?
I picked up archery before I can remember. There's pictures of me shooting a plastic bow from the dollar store with a suction cup arrow at a time I don't recall.
Yeah.
And then I had a fiberglass red bear bow that was hanging in the barn at my grandparents' farm. So I grew up in southwestern Pennsylvania on 135 semi-wooded acres, and my dad's got an airstrip, and that's really kind of what got us into deer hunting. We would mow that airstrip with a finish mower, like a lawn. All It was, I think, 500 or 800 feet wide by 1,800 feet long.
Wow.
So it'd take you about 8 hours to knock it down.
3 tanks of gas.
Yep. And Pennsylvania summers do get hot. So the tractor had headlights on it. And later on the zero turner that we got, I put headlights on, and we would watch the bucks start right about now, getting their beginning growth. And I mean, watch them grow straight through 130-inch deer.
Oh, wow.
And my brother actually was the first one to really get into hunting, and I just kind of made it a lifelong obsession with the focus on archery. So I've killed one deer with a rifle, and I've killed I don't know how many with a bow, but archery is my first passion, and I like riding dirt bikes and racing motocross, but I really like shooting my bow.
Good for you, man.
Yep.
Good for you. And you have a podcast too as well, right? So what's the content of that?
So it's called the Moto Ross Experience. And back in high school, someone said or wrote on the board the word motocross, and then they erased the C, and Moto Ross stuck. And then it also kind of became an alter ego that may or may not have gotten out of control a few times. And I just I stuck with it, and I would eventually like it to be a brand where someone says that's the Moto Ross gear or whatever. And so I've raced amateur supercross in the stadiums. They actually, in Denver and Mile High Stadium, when the Monster Energy comes to town, they've started doing amateur day where you basically sign up. Now you have to qualify in, but in the beginning years, 2018, 2019, and 2020, so I think I have that wrong. 2019, 2020, you could just sign up, show up, and go full send. And I mean, so basically what had happened was had this unique experience that no one, I guess, will have ever again because it will never be the same. And I got this idea. I was like, I'm going to put my Supercross amateur experience into a podcast and tell people about it because, as we'll get to later on, I was sitting in a hospital bed for 6 months, just like having to basically live through memories and live through YouTube, and
Hmm.
which is not something I was used to doing at all because I'm extremely active all the time despite having a desk job.
Yeah.
So
Well,
the Moto Ross experience is basically I've built dirt bikes, it has everything in it about what I am and who I am and how I've gotten to be this conglomeration.
that's awesome. We'll make sure to put a link to your podcast in the show notes. So if anyone wants to check that out, just look there. But you mentioned, you're going to mention it a little bit later. So why don't we kick things off, man? Why don't you set the stage? I know that you maybe you have one great story for us, and maybe a couple additional hunting stories for us. But why don't you kick it
Right.
off? Set the stage. Let us know when we are, where we are, what you're doing, and then go from there.
So the time period is the beginning of COVID. As much as I hate even thinking about it,
Yeah. Right.
COVID wasn't really my concern at this point. So I'm in the oil industry. My wife and I both are. And there was this day in April 2020, oil went negative, and it was the worst day career wise that anybody in the industry could have had. And ironically for me, I was out flying drones, which was kind of a new thing during the downturn that was caused by the pandemic. Cars stopped going to work, the price of oil dropped, and we were looking for unique ways to save money and find things to do. But all the while I was out there flying drones, I had this weird cough that just would not go away. And I also am very passionate about F45 training, which is high intensity interval training.
Hmm.
And it caused me to really not be suspect of this cough that I had because I could go and knock out a 45-minute workout with my heart rate around 175 for almost 45 minutes and not miss a beat. But I would have this stupid cough. And this went on for 3 months. And long story short, I finally ended up with a coughing fit that gave me chest pain. And I was 31 at the time. And so I went to the ER and I told them, I was like, you cannot just see me in my vehicle this time. I have got to get a chest x ray. Like I'm having a heart attack and I shouldn't be having a heart attack.
Yeah.
And so,
Jeez.
yeah, it was like one of those surreal afternoons that I hope less and less people in life get to experience. And I call it the best worst thing that's ever happened to me because they x rayed my chest, and what began as a normal day of just trying to get through a downturn period in the oil field and a unprecedented black swan event in the world was ultimately the beginning of the fight for my life. And they found a baseball sized tumor, so about the size of my fist. It was actually 14.3 centimeters at its largest. And it was right dead center inside my chest cavity. And it was just ever so slightly pushing on my right lung,
Ugh.
just enough to cause me to cough. And they really didn't know what it was. And so I spent one night in the hospital in Midland. And thank God my mom's a nurse and a bunch of friends of ours are in the medical industry back home. So I took these scans and I sent them to them. And a really good friend of mine who I now owe my life to said, this looks pretty bad. He said, actually, if there's something along the lines of, if you have any ideas that this isn't cancer, forget them now because it really, really looks like it.
Oh
And you better
man.
get back here quick so I can help you.
Yeah.
So I got on an airplane the next day with a backpack. That was June 5th when I found out that something was wrong. And it was like June 6th or 7th. We got back to Pittsburgh straight from the airport. to UPMC, and I owe those people like every day that I live now is a second chance because I ended up getting diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's primary mediastinal lymphoma, and actually learned later on when I came to MD Anderson here in Houston that mine was unique and it was considered bulky because of how large it was.
Wow.
So the scary part of this, and as much as I don't want to be a dark cloud, I don't really see it that way, but if it hadn't pushed on my lung, I never would have known it was there. And it
Wow.
ultimately would have spread to either my heart or it did end up spreading to my right lung. And they talked about taking half of it out. And I was like, if that's what it takes, that's what we'll do. Fortunately, that didn't happen.
Ross, I'll tell you right now, you're not being a dark cloud at all. Um, and I haven't shared this with you before, but my father-in-law, he was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Um, and he has actually a similar story to the point that all of a sudden one day he didn't have a cough. He actually got jaundice. So he was turning kind of that yellowish color.
Yep.
And as it turns out, it was pushing on his, and I may get this wrong, but I believe it was pushing on his gallbladder, and that's what made him go jaundice. And
Yep.
so they caught his pancreatic cancer early, which usually doesn't happen. In fact, it's a very lucky thing to just have some symptom to diagnose, right? So I don't know how familiar you are with pancreatic cancer, but usually you have about 6 months to live from when you are diagnosed, and he's still here today. I'm hoping to have him on the podcast because he's a hunter and I want to capture his stories because he's got some great stories about being up in Canada hunting moose and elk and all those things. But yeah, 3 years later, he's still with us just because his tumor was pressing on something similar to yours. So it's definitely not a dark cloud, man. It's a silver cloud. It's a good thing that happened to you. I mean, it's a good thing that you had a symptom to find it.
Exactly. Strange side note, my grandmother on my mom's side, so I'm a quarter Japanese. My grandmother that I'm talking about was 100% Japanese from northernmost island. Um, Also turned jaundice one day, had pancreatic cancer, also survived it and beat it.
Wow.
Unfortunately, is no longer with us, not because of cancer, but later on in life, I just anyway.
Yeah, my
But it's
father-in-law's
crazy.
still fighting, so he hasn't beaten it yet. But we're by all means we are well beyond what we thought we had left with him. So we're happy, but we're still fighting. We're all still there with him.
Yeah, I mean that's unfortunately this journey that life is a lot of fighting, and I hope the best for him, and we'll keep him in our thoughts and prayers here. And but I have every reason in the world to believe that he'll survive it just fine. He'll
Yeah.
he'll conquer it.
Yep. He's
And
he's he's a little ass kicker, so I'm sure he's going to do the best he can to kick some ass and
absolutely.
keep living. So, but I took us on a tangent there.
No.
Continue with your silver lined gray cloud.
So if I had not figured out that something was pressing there, it ultimately would have spread to something and just I would have just dropped over one day and been a serious mystery. I don't know what would have. I would assume autopsy follows something like that, and it's morbid to talk about. And so the reason I think it's relevant to hunting stories is I'd been living in West Texas when I found out about it, and I all of a sudden was back home on the farm I grew up on, the piece of ground that I'm the most connected to and will always be. And I think it played a huge role in my survival because the next 6 months and the 6 rounds of chemo that I did, I lost everything from the hair in my nose and my eyelashes, and I mean, it was all of it gone.
Yeah.
My beard fell out, and it was just the level that it takes you to. And I had a side effect called mucositis, where basically your body loses the ability to combat the bacteria that naturally is in your mouth that helps you digest food. And among just generally being destroyed from the chemo. And this hit me around round three. And ironically, round three um, was opening day of deer season in Pennsylvania. And I was bound and determined to get out there. And I actually sat in a tree stand with, I think I carried a bag of ice cubes out there because I couldn't not have something cold in my mouth at this point. I mean, it
Wow.
just, yeah.
Good for
When
you,
they
man.
had, yeah, it was, every time I sit in a tree stand now, I think about it. And I'm grateful that one, I'm still sitting in a tree stand at this point to reflect. But when they ask you, like, at the doctor, describe your pain level on 1 to 10, I never understood the disparity between 1 and 10 until I was like, 10 doesn't even cut it, folks. Like, you got to do something else. So I really, I struggled through that deer season of 2020, fighting cancer and also taking solace in just sitting in the woods because I didn't yet. They basically tell you, here's the plan, here's what we're going to do to kill the cancer and to get you well again, but we don't know if you'll respond to it. So in 2 months time, 2 rounds, we'll scan you and see if you're in early remission. So the same week that I found out I was basically diagnosed with cancer, I also found out I was going to be a father. And I was
Wow.
like, whoa. I was like,
I can't
this.
comprehend. I cannot comprehend that.
And I mean, you nailed it. I comprehended it in several different. It's weird. You learn things about your brain and the way your thought process happens. Because up until something like this, you don't ever really think about it. You have no real reason to. And so I went into this space of, okay, this may be the. They basically told me you might not be here in a year, and I was like, okay, there's nothing I can do about that. There's
Yeah.
only one way through this, and or one way out of this, and that is through it. And I've got the plan, and I've got the support team, so let's do it. Okay, now I'm going to be a dad, and so the point of that is, after chemo, it's quite rare to be able to reproduce naturally after that, if at all. And so finding out that I was going to have a son, as it ultimately came to be, was just like divine intervention of the man up above saying, "All right, pal, you better pony up and get ready to kick this thing because you've got to be here." And so I
That's awesome.
just, I really, I was sitting in the hospital and I was still working because we were working remotely and I didn't see any reason to stop. I mean, you're just going to sit there otherwise. So I would work 5 days a week and then I would drive down to my mom and dad's and I would go out and hunt. And believe it or not, I actually pulled my bow back on a decent 8 point. Uh, it had never been so hard to pull my bow back before. And I thought of that when we were doing the stress test at Elk Shape
Mm-hmm.
and I'm holding my bow at full draw for 1 minute. And I'm thinking to myself, this is not as hard as the day I pulled that bow back during chemo
Good
and
for
had to
you.
hold on that buck.
Yeah, I bet, man.
I was
I
just like,
bet.
same bow, maybe even the same set of arrows. So
Same
it
poundage,
just,
I assume.
yeah, I never backed it off. I
Good for
was,
you.
yeah, when, so initially they went and did a surgery called video assisted thoracic surgery, and they go in and cut through your rib cage, which hurts like, I can't even describe it. It's bad. Still
Yeah.
hurts today, actually. Some gnarly
Oh.
scars. And so they took about 3/4 of it out because they needed to biopsy it and find out what in the world it was. And I had been shooting my bow up to that point just to distract myself. And so I went downstairs after the allotted time frame and tried to draw it back, and I was like, just not happening. And so every day I'd go down in the morning and I'd pull just a little bit. And eventually one day I pulled it all the way back. And so I never did actually back my poundage down. I just didn't draw my bow until I could.
Yeah.
And so just being at home on the farm and hunting the area that I like to hunt, some of our old ladder stands are there from when I was a kid. And one of my hunting stories that I really wanted to tell, I and this is actually a gun story, believe it or not.
Uh-oh. We
Well,
won't tell anybody.
it's sort of a gun story. So I had a featherweight Winchester 30-06 that my dad bought me when I was like 12. It was my deer rifle. It kicked like a mule, let me tell you. I hated shooting that gun. And so at the same time, I discovered bow hunting, and that's all I did was carry a bow. So opening day deer season in Pennsylvania is usually the Monday after Thanksgiving, not Saturday like it is now. And so we actually got snow, which is fairly rare. And we were just excited. My brother was 12, I was 14. It was his first day with a gun in the woods. And my brother, his entire life, I watched him one time take a 22 Magnum with open sights and shoot a groundhog at 100 yards. I mean,
Oh,
I
wow.
was just same thing. Paintball gun, nobody stood a chance. So he takes my gun that morning. I take my bow with me, and I had a Hoyt MT Sport at the time, and I actually still have that one. It's kind of like a ornament piece in my parents' basement. And so I'm sitting there with my bow on opening day rifle, and my brother and dad are like maybe 100, 200 feet from me in this place that we now call the Lucky Spot. And so we border a hunting and fishing club on the backside of the property. And occasionally these guys would push by accident deer off the top of the hill that none of us had ever seen before. And so this particular morning they pushed, and I mean, it was like the Orange Army, is what we usually call it. They pushed this 10-point, 130-inch Boone and Crockett, and they pushed him like a half mile. And he ran within 100 yards of my brother in the woods in Pennsylvania. So you've got not as much elevation, obviously, as out west, but you've got hills and mountains and whatnot. My brother stood up at 12 years old, flat footed, and shot this buck with my 30-06 featherweight and dropped him in a single shot, clean through the heart.
Wow, that's amazing.
So there I am sitting there with my bow, like, this may have been an error. But that day was actually a realization for me. And it was the day that I feel like if somebody came to me and said, "When did you become a bow hunter?" that would be the day. Because I got to share that with my brother. And if I recall, we were homeschooled at the time. So we spent all of our time together.
Mhm.
And I really, I mean, would I have liked to have shot that buck with my bow? Sure. But I mean, it's a great family memory. He still hangs on the wall in my parents' house, and it's just something that'll always be. And that is the day that I became a bow hunter because I really, that's my brother's rifle. We never even discussed it. It's just something that has been. And
That's a great story, man.
yep. And so the stands that we were hunting out of that day actually got stolen. But we had some other ones that we had chained to the tree way up on top of the hill in another part of the farm that we really like. And those stands aren't really usable anymore, but they're kind of grown in. And it was just interesting to me sitting there in 2020, not really knowing if I was going to get through this thing that had come to what I consider the early part of my life. And I sat there one day, and I've actually got a picture. I'll send it to you. I took it of from my climbing stand down to the old stand that me and my brother and my dad used to hunt when we were before we ever thought that the world could get this crazy and that Ross might not be here or Ross might have to fight for his life to be here.
Mm-hmm.
And it was just that's what when you hear people say like the family farm and it's been here for generations, that's the kind of stuff that makes the family farm the family farm. I mean, you can't fabricate that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, my God. So the same farm, it's a unique place. There was an old railroad line that ran through it. I think it was considered a narrow gauge, so you can find railroad spikes and ties and We actually walk across the old trestle sometimes to cross the creek when it's too high during archery season. And so there's just a lot of history there. And so, has anybody had a Sasquatch story yet?
No Sasquatch stories. We've had some guys just get scared shitless and they don't know what for them, but no Sasquatch.
So, I think as hunters, we probably all have instances of where we were fatigued or we were young or adrenaline, what have you. So, one of my favorite stories that I love to tell, and my mom for a long time, she was like, "Quit telling people that." I'm like, "It's a fun story." I was like, "And I believe it." So, not too terribly long after my brother kills the Boone and Crockett, I think it was the following season or two later, everybody had bows. And my dad is one of those people that starts with one pin and can shoot every single distance before single pin sights were even a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're out there practicing, and I'm like, "What pin are you using?" And I was like, "Let me see your bow." Well, there's just one there. He dropped the other two all the way to the bottom. I was like, "That can't be right." Anyway, so we go out in the woods, and we had doe tags because Pennsylvania, you can buy them over the counter. And I mean, we had a pile of them because we love deer jerky. And this doe comes running in. I mean, it was one of those afternoons where it's kind of warm. You're sitting in the stand, sun's beating on you. It's like the perfect fall day, and you're almost asleep. And then the woods just explodes with deer and leaves, or it might be squirrels.
Yeah, most likely.
Well, in this case, it was actually a deer, and it was the first one we'd seen in a while. And so Dad draws back, and I mean, beautiful, perfect shot. Somehow, though, this was back during the early days of mechanical broadheads, and that's kind of what I blame it on. But this doe carried this stupid arrow almost clear across the farm, the better part of like 3/4 of a mile. And so it was late afternoon, kind of early evening, and we knew enough to not push her. So we waited till well after dark, and we start trailing this doe. And after about, I would say, the better part of 300 yards, we were like, "This isn't happening tonight." So we go back to the house. We get up real early the next morning, and it's Sunday. Well, Pennsylvania, you can't really hunt on Sundays. We get like one a year now that you can.
Oh.
And so we go out in the woods with flashlights, and I think we took one of the dogs with us, but we didn't have bows. And so we're trailing this doe. We knew pretty much where she was, but we'd had the farm timbered, so there was a lot of like treetops laying around. It was thick. It wasn't easy to navigate your way through. And so we split up, and the way our farm lays is it's actually quite a mountain, and it gets very steep at one point. And so the deer will hug this one trail that's an old logging road, and it kind of just switchbacks into the hill. So my theory was Dad and Sam, my brother, walk the logging road and see if she's there, and I'll go up above and see if I can look down and see this white belly. So I had a tiny set of Cisco binoculars. I don't know why I remember that name brand, but that's what I had. It's the way my brain works. And I'm looking down uh, to where my dad and brother are, and I suddenly see the deer. And as I'm looking through the binoculars, something else moves. And so there was some new growth, like maybe 3/4 of an inch around maple saplings. And they're all so close together that to walk through them as like a human upright, you'd have to take your arms and like put your hands together and part them and step over them. Well, that's exactly whatever this was that was not the dead deer that we were looking for. This thing walked upright, had long brown shaggy fur, kind of reminiscent of the mullet I had at Elk Shape. But all jokes aside, that's I was like 15 years old. I grew up there, never seen anything like this, and I knew the difference between a deer and we don't really have bear. We have more of them now than we used to, but the way this thing moved, it just wasn't a bear. And
Mm-hmm.
so I
Any
called my
particularly hairy neighbors?
not that hairy. I actually, at some point in my life, probably am the hairiest one. Yeah, recently when I got rid of the hair and beard, people legitimately at work didn't know who I was.
Yeah, no, you look different than you did at L Camp. I'll tell you that.
Yep, it was time for a little change. Plus, it's just too hot.
Well, man, I understand my mom tells you to stop telling that story, but was it, how long were you looking at this critter?
Oh,
Whatever it
good.
was.
Probably the better part of a minute.
Oh, wow.
It was a long sighting. And so when I say our farm is unique, there's a cave in the side of the hill that has a freshwater stream running through it. And I found it just by happenstance, the hill caved in. Uh, so there's that feature. Then up on top, unfortunately, when we had it timbered the last time, there was some confusion as to where the road would go. And there was what looked like old fire rings up on top of the hill. And nobody ever actually mapped it out. I'm one of the few that saw it from a tree stand up on top. But these fire rings were in the shape of a pentagram,
Oh,
which I always thought was
interesting.
odd.
You have some kind of Satanistic Bigfoot living on your property there, man.
I mean, it's just, and there's a rumor that there was an archaeological dig done on one of the hills around at some point. Whether it was ours, I don't know. But there was a lot of Native American. So, like Moundsville, West Virginia, is not that far from where I grew up. It's maybe an hour's drive, and there's an Indian burial mound there, not far from the state penitentiary. That's a hit at Halloween, and so there's a lot of that kind of stuff in the area. It's and I think a lot of it's been overlooked. And I don't know, it's those kind of things when you're out there in the woods and you're walking through the dark with your headlight on in the fog, and you're like, I'm a grown man, but I'm
Yeah.
allowed to be a little bit scared.
Yeah, no, especially you see some eyes light up from your headlamp or whatever it is. You're like, that's got to be a bobcat or a cougar. It's probably a raccoon, but
Yep.
there's something about the dark that no matter how big, no matter how hairy, no matter scary you are, but it scares you.
Yeah, it's wild.
Yeah.
Had one other experience one time that I really hope was a cow, but they haven't run cattle. They haven't run cattle on this side of the valley in years and years and years. And I was trailing a buck that I had hit, and it was one of those deals. It looked like a good shot, and I reviewed the footage from my GoPro, and it was a touchback. And so as I saw that, I knew where the buck was. He was above me on the neighboring ridge side. It was actually 11 o'clock at night on Halloween of all days. My parents were in the next town over at a Halloween party, and I called my dad. I was like, so I shot a big seven, and I don't think I made the greatest shot, and now I'm sitting in the middle of the woods in the dark, and I'm going to be here for a while. So when you're done with what you're doing, could you come find me? So I just sat back against this big old hardwood that honestly may be virgin timber because you couldn't get your arms around it. Maybe the two of us could touch fingertips, but this is a big old tree. And so I'm sitting there with my back against it, and it was a fairly clear, cold night. And there had been, like, I would say probably a couple does walked by, and I'm sitting there in the dark, just so still, almost half asleep. And I get woken up by like what felt like a cow approaching. And in my mind, I'm like, something big is in my general vicinity. And so I sat there a little bit scared to death. And sure enough, I turned my headlight on, and there was a hoof print between my knees and the dirt. And I, to this day, I mean, you talk about other guys saying they got scared absolutely to death for no reason at all. I made my way back to the house and luckily ran into dad with his headlight before I got there. And I was like, I think I'll recover this one in the morning. Strangely enough, we ended up going back and getting him. But I was just so, of course, then you Google things, and there's podcasts out there like Lore. Probably Lore is one of
Yeah.
the best ones. And I hadn't given this any thought until I was driving. I used to have an hour and a half commute each way when I lived in West Texas. And I started listening to that lore podcast, and he was talking about this goat man thing. And I was like, please don't be in the Northeast. And I'm pretty sure it was either Eastern Pennsylvania or New Jersey where there's folk history and tales of this goat man thing. And it has hoofs. And I was like, good God. I like hunting. I like going out in the dark, but I'm going to turn this off for now. So
Yeah.
take from it what you will, listeners.
Yeah.
But that's my, I don't know. Life is too short, and to not explore and think about what might be and scare yourself for fun. But some things that
Yeah.
I've actually seen and experienced. And,
Goat
and
man and Sasquatch man. You're living the fantasy dream here.
oh, and it's what's funny is the valley where I was sitting up above at the very mouth of it. There's an old, it's a fairly good sized old farmhouse, and I mean it's creepy as all hell. You look in the rear kitchen window, and it looks like whoever was there just left. Like tables and chairs. I mean they're turned over now, and people have vandalized it. But at one time, it looked like whoever was there for the summer just walked off and never came back, and straight up haunted house.
Man,
But
Ross,
yeah,
I'm not gonna be able to sleep tonight with all these stories you're telling me, man.
yeah, I try and keep it.
We should have
interesting.
saved this one for October, I think.
We should have. Who knows? By the time we get to October, I may have more.
Yeah, right.
But
That's good, man. That's good.
yeah.
Well, Ross, you got any more hunting stories for us? Otherwise, man, we've got a lot. You've given us a lot. You've given us a journey, man, and I'm glad that you're here to tell it to us.
We'll do one more. So the top of the hill where I was telling you about the fire rings, there also used to be Indian burial stones that were actually confirmed. It had been passed down word of mouth through the families that lived around the area. And so when they plowed the field, before it kind of got overgrown and became what we call the Oak Ridge, those stones were visible, and they plowed them and moved them off to the side, which actually ended up being just inside of our property line. And so I used to walk across them. They were like my marker. When I'd feel my boots hit those in the dark, I would know that I was getting close to where I turned south and head towards the house. So I didn't have to turn my light on and bust everything for the next morning. And so I knew they were there. They were giant stones. I mean, they're like the size of a Volkswagen bug. Like they're that big. Not something you would just pick up and walk off with in a night. There was between a half dozen and a dozen of them. And the area that they were in had a lot of like low growth walnut, which is just kind of scrubby tree, but extremely resilient, and a lot of grapevines that like to tear down trees. It wasn't an area that you could just walk in and dig up a big rock for your landscaping. And so that night, it was like early November. I'd walked in the afternoon after, I think it was in college still. And so I got in late, took a quick route in, and remembered stomping across those stones. And I was like, coming out this way, I fell in this giant hole in the dark. And I was like, what
Like
in the
you'd be
world?
like a good dip, or like you actually fell into a hole.
I fell into a legitimate size hole, like literally unexpected, walking in the dark. So I guess actually the way it happened is the day before I'd walked across them on my hunt that day, they were there. Then the next night, I came out a different way that took me across the rocks, and I fell in a hole where they used to be the day before.
Oh, okay.
So I get down to
These
the house, and
Volkswagen-sized rocks. That makes sense.
yeah,
Okay.
these giant size rocks. And so I get down to the house, and I tell my dad, I was like, you know the Indian burial stones that are allegedly on the edge of the property line? He's like, yeah. I was like, they're not there anymore. And so kind of looks at me funny. He's like, really? I said, yeah, I can go show you. There's like 6 or 10 craters up there. I fell in one in the dark, and the trees aren't disturbed. There's no sign of like a bulldozer coming in there. I mean, all it is a sleepy hayfield up there. And I mean, these are gigantic rocks. So, like, guys would not move them. You would need
Yeah.
machinery. And to this day, there's still shallow sunken spots where these stones were laying and they just disappeared overnight. I can't explain it. And what's funny is the neighbor that lived on the neighboring farm, he knew they were there because he hunted our property before we owned it back in like the 70s. And he was the one that
Hmm.
originally showed them to me. So I bump into him at the post office one day, and he asked me, he goes, "Those stones still up there?" And I was like, "Strange you should ask." I was like, "They're not."
Yeah,
He's
that's a
like,
weird thing to ask. You think that those things wouldn't go anywhere, but they
"Well,"
did.
I told him, I said, "I cannot for the life of me figure out how or where or when," because you would expect like to be driving along and just suddenly see them like gracing somebody's yard or whatever. Nothing anywhere. Nobody has any idea what happened to the alleged Indian burial stones that just floated away.
God, that's weird, man. You got, I was gonna say like I gotta get out to your property and hunt, but I don't want to go there anymore. You've given me enough goatmen, enough Sasquatch, and enough UFO stone retrievals to build the next Stonehenge on a different planet to like weird me out, Ross.
And it's just like this was all before Ancient Aliens and all this crap came out on the History Channel and YouTube. I mean, I was just like, that's strange. Like that's very inconvenient. There's some large holes here now. But yeah, it's but I've been fortunate. I've taken some nice bucks with my bow off the property in between all these strange experiences that have come to be. But
Yeah.
I actually I can shoot over easily over 100 yards on my home archery range there because it sits on the airstrip, and so it all ties itself together with being a drone pilot and
Yeah.
all that stuff. So
That's awesome, man. So I know we kind of we went off track at the end of your kind of cancer story to go into a couple other stories, but you were in
Mhm.
full remission.
I am in full remission as of December 14th of 2020. I got the "you are all clear," and
Wow.
so yeah, 2 weeks later we drove.
Congratulations, man.
Thank you. Yeah, it was wild. That's about the best way I can describe it. And
Yeah.
what we took on then is, so I finished chemo on November 6th. December 14th was officially the like you're all clear. And then between then and January 1st, we sold our house in Midland, moved everything in storage in Houston to storage in Houston, packed up an apartment in Pittsburgh. All the while, my wife was 8 months pregnant, and it was insane. So I never really took anything for granted in my life before, in my opinion. I tried not to. I mean, but the way I see things now, like my alarm went off this morning at 4 a.m. and I was just up and ready to do a workout. And I actually had the thought, it never gets any easier to get up at that hour, but I had the thought this morning. I was like, I'm pretty happy that I can even work out, let alone do it in the middle of the night, so that I can gain more time with the family and get just when you're fighting traffic 2.5 hours each way a day potentially, it makes sense.
Yeah. Nope, it makes total sense. A very finite amount of time with your family, you know,
Yep.
from you wake up till they go to daycare till whatever. You got to go grind it out at work for a minute, and then you get a couple hours at the end of the day. It's important to enjoy that time when you can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's been a journey, and it'll continue to be a journey because I had this idea at some point. I don't know why, wishful thinking or what have you, that I would return to my normal life. This is my normal life. This is who I have become, and this new perspective is just, it's the greatest worst thing that ever happened to me.
Yeah, of course, man. Well, I'm glad you're still here to tell your story. So hopefully this inspires somebody. and also terrifies a lot of people with your ridiculous, terrifying Pennsylvania stories. I'm never going back to Pennsylvania. But man,
Yep.
I think we're good for today. This has been fun. I know you have more for us, and we'll bring you back another time. But why don't you tell the people where to find you? Let them know about your podcast. Which one of the 3 Instagrams that you have is the right one, and wherever else you maybe want to send people.
So you can find me on YouTube at the Moto Ross Experience. You can find me on Instagram at MotoRoss_. There's also an Instagram for archery called Now Serving Archery. It's literally just the way it's spelled, all one word. And then I have a new Instagram for my drone activity that I'll be adding to. It's only got 5 pieces of content, and it is called at Flyover State O Mind. And I haven't really decided fully what I'm going to do with that. It's mainly just a portfolio of, if you're looking for drone footage, this is what the DJI Mini Mavic 2 is capable of in my hands. And so I'm working on, actually, I have Drone Launch Academy open in another tab here, and I'm going to go through all their courses and get myself trained up, and hopefully be putting content out there of the hunting nature and the tack nature and motocross. And
that's super cool, man. Super
cool. Lots of things going on.
Maybe I'll have to bring you out to Colorado, and you can drone footage some of my failed attempts at hunting.
Well, maybe the drone will add a layer of edge, and we'll make them successful.
Who knows, man?
Actually, my plan is, I don't know if I'm going to make it happen this year. I would really like to do over-the-counter Colorado elk. I don't know enough about it. I'm not putting any time constraints on myself and rushing into it, so likely this is going to be a 2023 thing. I'm planning on doing elk shape again, Livesay's course, all of it.
Mark's the best. He's going to be on this podcast probably in a month, so released in 2 months, but Mark is the best. Cool. All right, Ross. Thank you, man. It's been fun. You've told me some good stories. You told everybody some good stories. Hopefully, again, you inspired some people with your fight. And again, hopefully you didn't terrorize too many people about staying away from Pennsylvania, man. But I appreciate you. I appreciate you being on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. And if anybody reaches out to you that needs support and is going through something like I went through, send them my way.
Absolutely, man. Will do. Thank you again.
Thanks for having me, dude. Appreciate it. It was fun.
All right, guys. That's it. Another story in the books. If you have any feedback, please let us know. Just go to Instagram at huntingstories_official and DM us. And while you're there, of course, don't forget to follow. I want to thank Russ again for sharing his story of survival, and of course for his stories of all the crazy shit that he's seen in the backwoods of Pennsylvania. You know, he's making the most of his life now. He's had to fight hard for it. So go ahead and follow him on Instagram. It's at MotoRoss with an underscore. That's MOTOROSS_. And feel free to reach out to him if you feel like he inspired you today. And of course, go to your preferred podcast app, Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, whatever it may be, and subscribe, review, and comment on this podcast. Help us share it. And that being said, also share it with your friends and family. Now, finally, we're always looking for more storytellers. So if you, your dad, your mom, your friend, your dog, whoever has a good hunting story, hit us up on Instagram. We want to hear from every kind of hunter, as long as you can tell a good story. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks again for Ross for telling us stories. Now go make some stories of your own.